I remember the night I first brought him home, a bundle of blankets, barely breathing after my daughter passed. I was 40 then, still working nights at the diner, still trying to make sense of what life had taken from me. But when I looked into his tiny face, I promised him one thing: he'd always have a home. For 30 years I kept that promise. I packed lunches, worked overtime, fixed broken doors, and prayed over his mistakes. I watched him grow, watched him dream. I thought I'd done right by him. But one night, standing in the cold with a grocery bag in my hands, I realized he'd changed the locks. My keys didn't fit anymore. The porch light was off. And in that moment, the pain was real, but the silence inside me was stronger. Because love might make you give, but wisdom teaches you how to take back. I still remember the night I brought Michael home. He was only 3, small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. But his eyes were wide open, quiet, like he already understood something about loss. My daughter had just passed. Sudden, unexpected. I was 60 miles from home, standing in a hospital hallway with a plastic bag full of her belongings and a little boy who didn't cry, didn't ask for her. He just stared at the door she'd gone through and never came back from. That night, I made a promise. Maybe not out loud, but deep enough that it never left me. I promised that no matter what life threw my way, that child would have love, stability, and a home. I was 40 then, still working double shifts as a nursing aide at the county hospital. My knees already ached by morning, and money was always tight. But when you've got someone to care for, you find a way to stretch everything. The hours, the patience, the paycheck. The first few years were a blur of diapers, fevers, and lullabies. I remember sitting by his bed with my hand on his chest, counting breaths the way I did with my patients, just to make sure he was still there. The world had taken so much already. I wasn't about to let it take him too. He grew fast. By 5, he was full of questions. By 7, full of energy. And by 10, full of dreams too big for our little house, but just right for a boy who didn't know what couldn't be done. Our Saturdays were sacred. Pancakes, always with too much syrup, cartoons, then yard work. He'd follow me around with that little red rake I bought him, pretending he was helping. I used to tell him, if you love something, you take care of it. I meant the house. But I think in some way he thought I meant him, and that was fine with me. We didn't have much, but we had rhythm. Sunday church, Wednesday night, meatloaf, bedtime stories, he'd pretend not to like but always listen to anyway. Sometimes when the days were hard, when bills piled up or my body gave out, I'd find him at the kitchen table coloring something for me. "Grandma," it would say in shaky letters, "you're the best mom too. That one I kept in my Bible for 30 years. When he graduated high school, I was the one in the front row, clapping loudest. Everyone else had bouquets. I brought a single white rose. He called me his anchor in his speech that day. I don't think there's a prouder moment in my life. And when he went off to college, I cried, not because he was leaving, but because I'd done it. Against every odd, I'd kept him safe, given him wings. I kept his room just the same, the baseball posters, the shelf full of trophies, even the little nightlight shaped like a star. Every now and then, when I passed by, I'd straighten his blankets and whisper a prayer that the world would be kind to him. The house always felt a little quieter without his footsteps, but it was a good quiet, the kind that comes from knowing you've done something right. Years passed, and letters turned into phone calls into visits. When he told me he'd met someone, Jenna, his voice had that spark I hadn't heard in years. I was happy for him, truly. He'd grown into a fine young man, polite, thoughtful, working in finance now, saving for a house. When he brought her over for the first time, I noticed the way he looked at her. The same way my husband once looked at me when we were young. That kind of love makes you hope again. She was polite, that girl. Pretty, smart, ambitious. The kind of woman who speaks with confidence but not much warmth. She brought flowers and called me Miss Evelyn the first few times. I liked her fine, though I could tell she wasn't quite sure what to do with someone my age. I told her stories about how Michael used to run through the house in his socks, sliding across the floor. She laughed, a little forced, but she listened. That was enough. When they got engaged, I was over the moon. I pulled out my old cake stand, polished it, and baked them a batch of lemon squares, his favorite since he was a boy. He hugged me that night, real tight, and said, "You'll always be home, Grandma," and I believed him. After the wedding, they decided to move in with me for a while. The economy was rough, rent was high, and I had space. More space than I needed. It felt right. Life had come full circle. I used to tell him, "One day you'll take care of me." I guess I thought that day had come, in a way. We were a family again. At first it was lovely. Jenna cooked fancy dinners, quinoa, roasted vegetables, dishes I couldn't pronounce, but tried anyway. Michael helped with bills, fixed the leaky faucet, and brought me tea in the evenings. We'd sit on the porch together, talking about work, life, and the future. For a moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Not the kind that comes from duty, but from connection. But little things began to change, all at once, just slowly. One morning I noticed my old rocking chair, the one I used when I nursed Michael's mother, wasn't by the window anymore. It had been moved to the garage to make space for the new decor, Jenna said. She smiled when she said it, so I let it go. I told myself it didn't matter. A week later I saw that the curtains I'd sewn by hand had been replaced with something more modern. She meant white and simple. No pattern, no story. I didn't mind, not really. Change is good, I told myself. Maybe it's time for this house to feel young again. But some part of me missed the sound of the rocking chair creaking while I read in the evenings. I missed the way the sun filtered through those old curtains, painting the floor gold. Then there were the meals. We used to eat together, all three of us. But slowly dinner became something they had upstairs while I watched TV alone. When I offered to cook, Jenna would smile and say, "We already ate," her tone light but final. I tried not to take it personally. It's just how young folks are now, I thought. Busy, independent. Michael was working long hours, and when he came home he was tired. Still, he always kissed my forehead, still called me Grandma. That was enough to keep me from saying anything. Because love, real love, makes excuses. But sometimes I'd find myself sitting at the kitchen table late at night, my tea gone cold, wondering when the house stopped sounding like mine. There's something about aging that makes silence heavier. When you're young, quiet means peace. When you're old, quiet means distance. I started noticing how often Jenna used the word we. We're thinking of painting the living room. We want to update the locks. We think it'll be better for everyone. Everyone. That word made me pause. I guess I wasn't part of that we anymore. Still, I kept the faith. I told myself families go through seasons. Maybe this was just adjustment. Maybe once they settled in, the laughter would come back. Maybe once Jenna felt at home, she'd let me feel at home too. But one afternoon I walked past Michael's old room, the one I'd kept just as it was all those years. The trophies were gone, the posters were down, the bed had been replaced. It wasn't his room anymore. It wasn't anyone's room I recognized. And something inside me, something small and steady that had survived for decades, shifted. That night, I stood at the doorway, my hand on the frame, and thought about all the years that had passed. Every late-night shift, every scraped knee I bandaged, every time I said no to myself, so I could say yes to him. You don't raise a child expecting repayment. You do it because love tells you to. But there's a quiet kind of heartbreak that comes when you realize the world you built for someone no longer has a place for you in it. I didn't cry, not then. I just took a deep breath, closed his door, and walked away. It was the first time I'd ever felt like a guest in my own home. And though I didn't know it yet, that was just the beginning. Because love can make a home, but pride and power and a little too much comfort can unmake it just as quietly. And soon, my house, the one I'd built with years of sweat and prayer, would stop feeling like mine altogether. It started with the word update. That was Jenna's word, always so tidy, so harmless. "We're just updating, Evelyn," she'd say with that polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I remember the first time she brought it up. She was standing in the living room, looking around like an interior designer who'd stumbled into a thrift store. "You've done such a lovely job keeping this place cozy," she said. "But maybe we could brighten it up a little. You know, make it more us. More us." At first I didn't think much of it. She was young, full of energy, full of ideas. I wanted her to feel welcome, to feel that she could make this house a home too. So I nodded and said, "Sure, honey, do what you think looks nice." I figured maybe she'd buy a rug or hang a new mirror. Small things. Nothing that would shake the bones of the house I'd built. But I was wrong. Within a week, boxes started arriving. Big ones, marked with words like "assembly required." Furniture, lamps, some kind of modern shelving that looked more like art than something useful. I told myself not to fuss. They're making it their space, I thought. That's what families do. They add, they build. But the thing about change is that sometimes it sneaks up on you. It starts small. Then it takes root. One morning I came downstairs and found my old coffee pot gone, the one my husband bought me for our 20th anniversary. In its place was a sleek metal contraption that looked like it belonged in a cafe. "Oh, I thought this would make mornings easier," Jenna said, cheerful as ever. "The other one was just so vintage." She meant old, but she didn't have to say it. I smiled because that's what you do when you're trying to keep peace. I told her it looked nice, and I meant it, even if it didn't feel like home anymore. Then came the curtains. My floral ones, the ones I sewed by hand when Michael was still a teenager, came down without warning. I came into the living room that afternoon, and they were gone, folded neatly in a box. In their place hung white drapes that didn't hold light so much as block it. The room felt cold, empty. I remember standing there holding one of my old curtains in my hands, running my fingers along the stitching. Each thread, each tiny flower I'd sewn while he was studying at the kitchen table. I wanted to ask why, but the truth is, I already knew. When you kind, they don't speak out loud. I started noticing other things missing too. My framed wedding photo disappeared from the hallway. The cross above the doorway, gone. The little figurines I collected from yard sales over the years, the ones that made this place mine, quietly replaced with glass vases and abstract art. I didn't say a word. I told myself things were just moving around, not vanishing. But deep down I could feel it. The slow erasing of a life, one picture, one curtain, one memory at a time. Even the sound of the house began to change. The floorboards that once creaked under familiar footsteps now echoed with voices that didn't belong to me. The smell of my morning coffee, rich and comforting, was replaced by something sharper, cleaner, colder. I started keeping to myself more. I didn't mean to, it just happened. When they watched TV, I'd stay in the kitchen, pretending to read. When they had dinner, I waited until afterward to eat something small for myself. I told myself they were just busy, adjusting, figuring out their own rhythm. But every time I walked past the dining room, I saw the same thing. The two of them, heads bent close together, laughing quietly. Not once did they look up and ask if I wanted to join. Still, I tried to find the good. I'd leave fresh cookies on the counter, or fold their laundry without being asked. Small things, the kind you do when you love someone. That's how I'd always lived, showing love in quiet ways, expecting nothing in return. But love can start to ache when it has nowhere to go. I remember one evening, I was folding towels in the laundry room, and I heard Michael's voice from the living room. "Mom's really set in her ways," he said. It stung, the way he said, "Mom," like I was just someone who happened to live there. Then Jenna's voice, smooth and soft. "She means well, but she's not exactly easy to live with, is she?" Hands froze mid-fold. Michael laughed. A light, thoughtless laugh. "Yeah, I know, I just don't want to hurt her feelings." And Jenna said, "She'll be fine. She's comfortable here. She doesn't need much space." I stood there, surrounded by the hum of the dryer, listening to my own heart break quietly. You spend a lifetime giving meals, money, patience, forgiveness, and you start to believe that love will protect you from being unwanted. But that's not always true. Sometimes, love just gives people permission to take more. That night, I went to bed early. I didn't pray before I slept. For the first time in a long time, I just stared at the ceiling and thought about the word comfortable. As if comfort meant small, as if peace meant silence. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast, poured coffee, asked about their day. Jenna barely looked up from her phone. Michael smiled, distracted. They had plans, something about locks for security. "Security?" I asked. "Oh, just in case," Michael said. "The neighborhood's changing. You can never be too careful." I wanted to say something, but the words got stuck. He didn't look at me like a man asking for permission. He looked at me like someone giving notice. Later that week I came home from the store and saw a man in a work uniform at the door. "Locksmith," he said cheerfully. "That a work order for this address." I stood there on the porch, holding a bag of groceries, watching him remove the lock I'd had since my husband's time. It was old, sure, but it had a certain sound when it turned, a soft click that always made me feel safe. Now it was being replaced with something shiny, something new, something that didn't belong. When I asked Michael about it later, he said it was for everyone's safety. Jenna nodded, adding, "We'll make sure you have a copy, of course." Of course. I smiled because I'd learned by then that smiling was easier than explaining what a home really means to someone who never built one from scratch. Weeks went by, and I adjusted to the quiet. I cleaned less, spoke less, stayed out of their way. Sometimes I'd take my tea out to the porch and sit in the evening light, listening to the sounds of my own house through the window, their laughter, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of the TV. It's strange how sound can both comfort and cut you. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, maybe close to midnight. I'd gone downstairs to get a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I heard their voices. I wasn't trying to listen, it just happened. "I love her," Michael was saying, his voice low, tired. "But it's complicated. I don't know how to tell her we need the space." And Jenna said, softly, like she was sharing a secret, "You don't have to tell her, we'll figure it out. She's a sweet woman, but she's becoming a burden we'll need to manage soon." A burden. The word hung in the air like smoke. I stood there in the dark hallway, my fingers gripping the doorframe so tight I could feel my pulse in them. I didn't make a sound, didn't move. A burden, after everything. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The moonlight came through the window, falling on the empty space beside me, the one where my husband used to sleep. For a moment, I felt that same kind of loneliness, that hollow space where love used to live. But under it, under the hurt, the disbelief, something steadier started to rise. I wasn't angry yet. Not exactly, but I knew something had shifted, and it wasn't the furniture this time. They could move my things, replace my curtains, even change the locks. But they hadn't changed me. Not yet, and in that silence, I promised myself something. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, but out of the same love that once built this house brick by brick. If they wanted to make it their home, they'd soon learn what it really meant to earn one, because I may be 70. But I'd been here long enough to know, when life tries to move you out of your own story, you don't beg for space. You start taking it back quietly. The door wouldn't open. I remember that moment like a photograph, the kind you take without thinking, then stare at for hours afterward. I had been at my sister's for the day, drinking coffee and trading stories, letting her fuss over me the way only a sister can. It was a small comfort, a soft place to land after the weeks of quiet that had settled over the house. I left with a bag of her lemon squares tucked under my arm, and the first real laugh I'd had in days warming my chest. The porch light was off when I got back. That should have been my first clue, but maybe I'd been holding on to the wrong clues all along. I reached into my pocket for my key the way I always did. The key with the small chip from the time I dropped it in the sink, the key that had opened this doorway for years and years. And it always fit, always turned with that familiar, comforting click. That night it refused to turn. For a second I thought it was my hands, old, stiff, from years of waking up before dawn, from folding towels for a family of one, and then another, from gripping a steering wheel through too many late-night drives. I tried again, angling the key, easing into the lock the way my hands used to ease into a piano they'd played for decades. No click, just a stubborn metal sigh. The lock held firm. I laughed at myself then, a small, helpless sound. Maybe the lock is only stiff, I told myself. Maybe the lock got to it. Maybe I'll call Michael, and he'll pop the door open, and we'll all have a laugh about it. But when I looked up at the door, a small white note taped near the knob stopped, my breath before it had a chance to come out. Call before coming, no name, no explanation, just the words, blunt in their courtesy. I called Michael, no answer. I called again, voicemail. I called Jenna. Straight to voicemail, then silence. I stood on my front step with a bag of lemon squares cooling against my hip, the evening air smelling faintly of wet leaves and distant dinner, and I felt, oddly, almost absurdly, like an intruder outside my own life. I could have knocked. I could have banged my fist on the door until somebody opened and apologized. Instead, I sat in my car and watched my house through the windshield. You notice things from a parked car you don't notice when you're inside. The way the lamplight pooled against the front windows. A shadow moving past the curtains. A human shadow, the shape of two people sitting close. The way the mailbox leaned a little crooked from years of being opened and closed. I watched all of it, small as it was, and the house looked both familiar and foreign, like a town you used to live in but haven't visited in decades. My hands were folded in my lap. The lemon squares were forgotten at my feet. I had no idea how long I sat there. Time loses its edges when grief is your companion the way it had been mine for so long. A radio hummed low in the car next to me. A dog barked across the street. The world went on with that stubborn persistence people usually reserve for seasons and rain. At first, the hurt was the loudest thing. It pooled hot and heavy behind my chest, the kind that makes your throat close and your breath come quick and shallow. I thought about the small things, my curtains gone, the photos tucked away, the rocking chair in a garage I hadn't been in for months, and they pricked like little thorns all over me. I thought, not for the first time, about all the ways I had given and given and given. Blankets, bread, bandages, bedside care, a life's worth of tending that had apparently not taught everyone gratitude. But as the minutes passed and the streetlight hummed its steady yellow, the pain began to change. It cooled. It took on a new shape, clearer edges, quieter purpose. Hurt became a lantern I could look at without gasping. The sharpness of the word burden floated back to me from the night I'd overheard them, and the sting was still there, but beneath it was something else. A small, practical sort of anger. The kind that doesn't roar but organizes itself into sentences and plans. I watched the kitchen window, where long ago Michael used to stand with flour on his hands and a grin on his face. Tonight it held a glow, and the two figures moving inside looked comfortable, like a photograph of a life that had left me out. I let the photograph sit for a bit. Then I turned the key in my pocket one more time, just to feel its weight. I didn't cry, not then. I had the kind of weeping before that night that racked me for whole afternoons, the kind that left me wrung and small. This was different. This was the kind of sadness that steadied itself into resolve. I felt my shoulders lower, not in defeat, but like a person deciding to stand straight after a long bend. The car warmed around me. The lemon squares, I realized, tasted dry what I thought about them. So I wrapped them back in the napkin and put them in the glove box. I sat there until the street emptied, and the houses went dark one by one, and in the quiet I made a list in my head. Not a long list, just the things that could be done when you'd done everything else. In the morning the world looks different. The dark hush of the night softens into outlines. The anger that feels too hot to touch in darkness is cooler with daylight. That's how it was for me. I slept a little, though sleep felt thin. I woke with the taste of lemon still in my mouth, and I fixed myself a cup of coffee like I always did, black with a single spoonful of sugar. I dressed in a sweater that had seen better winters and tied my shoes with hands that didn't tremble as much as they used to. I made phone calls. They were calm calls, measured, no shaking, no pleading. I called people whose names rose easily in my memory, those stable points in my life who still had the smell of my husband's cologne on their sleeves, who'd seen this family grow from breathless beginnings to the muddled place it was now. I called Mr. Langley. His voice was slow and steady like a clock. He used to be the attorney from church who liked to reset the thermostat when he came by. He helped me refinance once, the paperwork folded into the box marked taxes in the spare closet. When I said, "Mr. Langley, do you have a minute?" he was there, immediate and present. I told him exactly what had happened. No big words, no dramatic flourishes. "My key wouldn't turn last night," I said. "There's a note on the door. They're not picking up their phones." There was a pause, the kind that in his voice felt like a shuffle of papers. He said, "Evelyn, I'll come by this afternoon. Bring anything you have. Deeds, mortgage statements, old receipts. If it's in your name, it matters. If it's not, we'll see what can be done." I hung up and called the mortgage company's number, the same one on the paper I kept folded in my Bible. An automated voice told me my account number, then transferred me to a human who checked the records. She asked for my name and my address, then read back a few lines that felt like music. My name listed on the account. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and thanked her. "Yes," I said, small and astonished. "That's right, thank you." It was a simple thing. Paper and print. Yet that thin line of ink felt like a rope thrown across the gap they'd tried to build. Next I called the pastor from my little church, Pastor Ruth, who'd been there at my daughter's funeral, who had held my hand that long night when the world blurred into a single hard sound. She listened with that kind of attention that feels like prayer, and when I asked if she'd come by later to witness whatever steps I needed to take, she answered, "Of course, we'll stand with you." I made a few more calls. My neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, who had a memory like a ledger and a heart like a porch swing, promised to check her security camera footage and tell me if she saw anything odd. My cousin, who worked part-time at the county clerk's office, said she'd look up historic filings to see if anything had changed recently. Each call was the same, short, factual kind. I felt a strange relief in the manner of it all, as if speaking made the world more orderly. The phone in my hand was heavier with possibility than it had ever been. By late morning, the house that had felt so closed off the night before had a small crowd of allies in motion. Mr. Langley would bring forms. Pastor Ruth would bring her steady presence. Mrs. Ellison would bring footage and gossip. My cousin would check the public record. I made another quieter call to Michael's number, left a message that simply said, "Call me when you can. We need to talk." No accusation, no pleading, just a placeholder where a conversation might go. After I hung up the last call, I sat at the kitchen table and put my hands around the warm mug. The sunlight slanted through the window and lit the dust motes like tiny ships on a slow sea. I watched them float and felt something I hadn't felt in a long while, a kind of steady certainty, like the slow, sure turning of a wheel. I did not want to hurt anyone. I wanted fairness. I wanted my life, the years of work and care, to be acknowledged rather than quietly shuffled away. I wanted the boy I raised, now a man who once hugged me and said I would always have a home, to remember what that meant. So I gathered the little things I could find immediately: a folded mortgage statement from the bureau, the old warranty that had my husband's name on it, the faded receipt for curtains I'd bought when Michael was small. Each paper fit into my hand like a found relic, proof of presence. There would be more to do. I knew this would not be a simple conversation over coffee or a short walk down memory lane. Legal things are carried out in forms and filings and patience. But for the first time since I'd pressed my palm to the doorknob and found nothing but tape and the note, I felt the arc of the story bend toward me instead of away. I sat with my coffee and the papers and let the afternoon come. The house hummed with the sound of ordinary life. Somewhere, dishes clinked and a kettle clicked off. It was soft, domestic noise, not the harsh silence I'd sat with at midnight. I breathed in the smallness of it, the smell of lemon squares, the memory of my sister's laugh, the way the light hit the kitchen table just so. When Mr. Langley knocked on the door that afternoon, I answered with the same calm I'd used on the phone. He tipped his hat and set a briefcase on the table like it had a map inside. Pastor Ruth arrived with a casserole and a softness that felt like healing. Mrs. Ellison came with a USB stick and a smile that said, "I've got your back." My cousin texted that the clerk's office would pull the records first thing in the morning. We sat and we talked, and the papers arranged themselves into something practical. It wasn't dramatic. There were no television cameras, no shouting, just small human things, signatures, witnesses, the turning of pages, and in the quiet moments between words, I felt the shift complete. Pain had given way to purpose. Hurt had become something like clarity. Mr. Langley arrived right on time, the way men of his generation always seemed to. He still drove that same blue Buick with the cracked leather seats, still carried a briefcase that looked too heavy for his frame. When he stepped out of the car and saw me standing by the porch, his face softened, the years between us shrinking like paper under sunlight. "Evelyn," he said, voice low, steady, the kind that used to calm people in courtrooms. "You look like you've been holding your breath a long time." I smiled a little, though it didn't reach far. "Maybe I have," I said. "Come in, Henry." It felt strange saying his first name after so many years. Back then, he was always Mr. Langley, the one who helped my husband and me figure out the paperwork when the house was still new, when we were young, and sure that life could be built with enough hard work and patience. He was a friend of my husband's from church, and after my husband passed, Henry was the one who walked me through refinancing the mortgage, made sure I understood every dotted line before I signed. He had a way of explaining things that made you feel safe, like the world was still made of fairness if you just knew where to look for it. Inside, I'd already laid everything out on the kitchen table, my folder of papers, the stack of mail, even the old envelope with my husband's handwriting on it. The same kitchen, the same light, but it all felt different now, like the house had turned its back to me. Henry pulled out his glasses and began to look through the papers. The steady rustle of paper was the only sound in the room for a long while. He didn't ask many questions at first, just worked through each sheet with the patience of a man who's seen too many people forget how important small details can be. "Do you still have the refinance agreement from 2011? He asked eventually. I reached under the stack and pulled it out, the yellowed page folded neatly, my name written there beside my late husband's. I had kept it all these years, though I couldn't have told you why until that moment. Maybe because something in me always knew to keep proof of what I'd built. He studied it for a long time, then leaned back in his chair, his thumb pressing against the bridge of his glasses. "Well," he said softly, "I'll be damned." "What is it?" I asked. He tapped the paper. "You never signed a quitclaim deed." I blinked at him, unsure what that meant. "Evelyn," he said, meeting my eyes, "you still own this house. Your name is on the deed. Right here, see? That means it can't be sold refinanced, or transferred without your consent. No matter what they think they've done." For a moment I didn't say anything. The words hung there between us, heavy and quiet. The sound of the clock ticking in the hallway filled the space. I began, the thought catching in my throat. "They never checked?" He shook his head slowly. "Probably assumed they didn't need to. Happens more often than you'd think. Folks get comfortable, think paper follows intention. But it doesn't. Paper follows ink." He gave a small smile. "And Evelyn, your ink is still on this house." I looked down at my own handwriting, the faint smudge where I'd signed years ago. My hands were steadier then. My name curved neatly across the page. A promise, a stake in the ground. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For weeks I'd been walking around feeling invisible, erased from the home I built brick by brick with my husband, erased by the very person I raised with both hands. And here it was, proof that I was still here, still counted, still mattered. Henry kept going through the papers, each one adding another layer to the story. The insurance documents, the tax records, the utility bills, all in my name. It was like unearthing a map of my life, one piece of paper at a time. As he worked, I made us tea, just like old times. The kettle whistled softly, steam curling through the quiet house. It reminded me of afternoons long ago when the biggest worry I had was making sure Michael had finished his homework before dinner. When I brought the cups to the table, Henry looked up and gave a small, knowing smile. "You did everything right, you know that. You built this place. You kept it running. You've got every reason to hold your head high." "I thought I lost it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd given it away without realizing it." He shook his head. "No, Evelyn. You can't lose something that's yours unless you let it go willingly." "And you didn't." I stared down at the tea, the ripples catching the light. It was the first time in months, maybe years, that I felt something like strength stir in my chest again. Henry stayed a while longer, walking me through what to do. "Next, you don't need to confront them yet," he said. "You just make sure you've got everything in order. Your deed, your tax records, the mortgage statements. When the time comes, you'll be ready." "I don't want to fight," I told him. He smiled softly. "Then don't fight, just stand where you already belong." That night, after he left, I sat at the same kitchen table long after the dishes were done. I spread the papers out in front of me, one by one. My name, printed, signed, repeated, stared back from every page like a small chorus saying, "You're still here." The house was quiet, except for the soft creak of the walls settling. Somewhere upstairs, a memory played itself out. The sound of a child's laughter echoing through the hallway, the patter of small feet on the stairs. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. I thought about Michael, about the boy who used to climb into my lap with scraped knees and stories about monsters under the bed. The boy who used to say, "Don't worry, Grandma, when I grow up, I'll take care of you." I wondered when that boy had disappeared, and whether he even remembered making that promise. But I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger burns fast, and I was past the point of flames. What I felt now was something else, a steadiness like the ground beneath my feet had finally stopped shifting. The papers were more than documents. They were proof of what I'd built, yes, but also a reminder of something deeper, that the foundation of this house wasn't wood or nails or title deeds. It was the life I had poured into it. Every meal cooked, every bedtime story told, every storm weathered beneath this roof. They could change the locks, the curtains, even the laughter, but they couldn't erase me from its bones. In the days that followed, I went about life as usual. I smiled when I saw neighbors, tended to the little garden patch out front, made polite small talk with the mailman. I even passed Michael once downtown. He waved from across the street, his expression nervous, almost guilty. I waved back, calm, polite, steady. At home, I tucked the papers neatly into a folder labeled property. I didn't hide it, but I didn't flaunt it either. I placed it on the top shelf of my cabinet, right above the old family albums. Every night before bed, I glance at that shelf and feel a quiet sense of assurance, the way a sailor must feel knowing there's a map in his pocket when the sea looks endless. There were moments, soft, unexpected ones, when I caught myself feeling sorry for them. For Jenna, with her polished manners and her need for control. For Michael, caught between loyalty and pride. They didn't understand what they were building their comfort on, a foundation of someone else's sacrifices. And maybe in their own way they'd forgotten that. Maybe they thought time had washed my name off the deeds, same way it had weathered the paint on the porch. But time doesn't erase what's done right. It only deepens it. One evening, while sorting through old photo boxes, I found a picture from the day we first moved into this house. I was young, standing on the porch with my husband, holding a little toddler Michael in my arms. We were laughing, sunlight on our faces. I looked at that photo for a long time before tucking it into the folder with the papers. It belonged there, proof of where it all began. The next morning, I woke up early, earlier than usual. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun stretch across the yard. The world outside looked peaceful, ordinary, but inside me, something had shifted completely. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to march up to that door and demand to be let in, because truth doesn't rush. It waits, and so would I. I would wait, patiently, quietly, the way a storm gathers before breaking. I'd wait for the knock, the phone call, the inevitable moment when they'd realize the walls they thought they owned weren't theirs to claim. When that day came, I'd be ready, not with anger but with something stronger, proof, peace, and the calm of someone who finally remembers her own power. He knocked like a man who wasn't sure he had the right to be there anymore. 3 soft, hesitant taps that felt small and almost apologetic. I opened the door before he could wait for an answer. Seeing him at my threshold, all the years folded into his shoulders, I felt a strange mix of pity and something steadier than either pity or anger. He was my grandson, the boy I had promised to keep safe, and here he was, looking like a man who'd been bruised by his own decisions. He came in holding his hat like it was fragile. His smile was the sort he'd used when he was young, polite, a little practiced. "Hi, Grandma," he said, voice thin. "Do you have a minute?" I set the kettle on. My hands moved through the ritual of it without fuss. There's something about making tea that steadies people, the way the steam softens the heart. I fixed 2 cups, black, like he liked it, though I'd long ago learned he took his coffee with more sugar than sense, and led him to the small table by the window. The afternoon light came in slanting and forgiving, dust motes floating like tiny ships. The apartment felt like the inside of a hand, small, safe. He sat down, fingers worrying the rim of his hat, and for a moment all he did was breathe. The silence between us had weight. It had the same weight as the note on my door months before, the same weight as the night I'd sat in my car and watched lights behind glass. I poured the tea and pushed his cup toward him without a word. He smiled that strained smile again, took a sip, and for the first time I counted the lines around his eyes differently. Not as the traces of a carefree life, but as the map of someone who'd learned too quickly the price of shortcuts. When he started to talk, it was in a rush of things he needed to explain, the kind of hurried speech people use when they are looking for absolution, or at least a soft place to land. "It's the mortgage," he said. "We tried to refinance. The bank, they said the paperwork wasn't clear." "Jenna," he stopped, swallowed, and I saw how tired he was of saying her name like a talisman. "She thought it would be quicker if I did it my way. I signed some papers. I thought I had the right to. I thought if I pushed it through, everything would be fine. We were so sure." I watched him out of the corner of my eye. His hands were small in my memory, and large in his adulthood, the calluses from work and worry. He looked like someone who'd carried too much alone for too long. "You weren't in the bank that day?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "No. I told them you wanted to be helpful. I told them you were on board. I thought it was okay. I don't know, Grandma." He laughed a brittle sound, then covered his mouth and looked at me with something that shifted between apology and pleading. "I should have talked to you. I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." There was a moment where the room held only his apology and my cup cooling on the saucer. I didn't want to make his guilt worse. Guilt is a hot thing that can burn a person down if you press against it. I reached across the table and touched his knuckles, a small steadying thing. "You're here now," I said. "Tell me where we are." He told me. He told me about the bank refusing the transfer because the deed wasn't clear, about creditors sniffing around, about Jenna's frustration turning into anger, about the late-night calls that ended in slammed doors. Each sentence was a small avalanche of consequences, the kind that form fragile decisions pile up. When he finished, his eyes were wet, and the man I'd raised with sugar and patience looked very small. "I don't know what to do," he said. "They say I should move out. Jenna says it's better if we don't have to worry about the mortgage while things get sorted." I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting us. Protecting. The word wanted to be tender, but it arrived with jagged edges. I could see for a moment the boy who had built forts out of blankets and promised to stand guard against thunder. I could also see the man who had let fear and haste guide his hands when steadier judgment was needed. There was sorrow there, for him and for what it had cost. I listened the way a person listens who has lived long enough to know that listening sometimes does the work anger wants to do. My voice came out soft. "Michael, I don't need you to defend yourself. The tea steamed between us in a quiet cloud. I raised you. I know your heart." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face as if I'd offered him something he assumed taken for good, and found it returned. "I know I messed up, Grandma. You made choices," I corrected gently. Not to shame him, but to name it. Choices can be fixed. Mistakes can be learned from. The difference is in how you stand afterward. And now we make other choices. He blinked. "How? What can we do?" I reached into the cabinet and brought out the folder. The papers inside were the steady kind: deeds, tax statements, a copy of the mortgage paperwork with my name in ink I'd once thought old and faded. I slid the folder across the table, and it made a soft thud against the wood. For a second I watched the color leave his face like paint being washed off by water. He stared at the documents the way a hungry man stares at a table set after a long fast. "What?" His voice broke. "How did you—" "Everything," I said. "The papers, the receipts. You know me. I keep things because a life isn't just moments. It's proof." I watched him process each line, the way his eyes moved from my name to the signatures to the stamps. When he reached the page that said deed, his fingers trembled. "It's in your name," he whispered. The realization landed like rain. "You own this. I thought we had taken it. I thought we were doing the right thing." "You were trying to make room for your life," I said. "I understand that, but making room doesn't have to mean erasing the person who made it possible." My voice stayed steady. I was not looking for drama. I was looking for truth. For him to see what he had taken for granted, and for him to feel the weight of what that means. He put his hands on the table like a man steadying himself. I never wanted to hurt you. I just thought I was being grown up. I thought Jenna would feel at home. We were trying to build something." His brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. There are things a person can say that make a wound worse, and other things that ease it. I'd learned over decades that the sharpness of righteous anger seldom helps. So I did not scold. I did not shout. I let the silence settle between us like a blanket, and then I leaned forward a fraction and said, 'I spent 30 years giving, Michael. 30 years. That gave you room to learn and love and make a life. Now I will spend the years I have left choosing where to belong.'" His shoulders sagged as if a great weight had been lifted, and then placed on him all at once. He breathed out a sound that might have been relief or terror, or the shape of both. What will you do?" he asked. "I'll do what I always have," I said. "I will be sensible, I will be kind, I will make decisions that keep me safe and whole." I kept my voice small but firm. "You can stay and work with me, to keep this house as home for all of us. Or you can find another way. I won't beg you. I won't force you. But I will not let the years of my life be rearranged without my say." He looked at me then the way a child looks at the parent who first taught him to tie his shoelaces, and then let him walk the first steps alone. There was sorrow, yes, and fear, but there was also something like understanding dawning. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," he said again, and this time the apology was not a plea, but the beginning of responsibility. "I'll make it right, I'll do whatever you say." We sat there for a long time, tea gone cold, the sunlight turning the dust in the air golden. I thought about the kitchen table where he had once done homework under the lamp, scribbling the kind of math problems that made him frown, and then grin when the answer clicked. I thought about the nights I had stayed up, counting his breaths like I'd counted patients in the hospital, making sure everything inside him was still steady. "What I want," I said finally, "is honesty. If you're going to stay, I want you to be part of this home honestly. Pay your share, help when you're needed, call me when you leave, and when you come back, treat me like the person who raised you, not the guest who happened to live here." I let each word land in the space between us. They were small demands, the kind that make a house a home. He nodded, and when he did, it was as if a boy's promise and a man's duty had merged in him all at once. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I can do that. I will do that." We did not make grand plans that afternoon. There were lawyers to see, and papers to file, and quiet conversations to come. There were apologies to be offered and trust to be built again, the slow work of mending that only time can do. But the folder sat between us like a hinge that could swing either way, reached for his cup and sipped, then set it down with a steadiness that surprised me. "You could have been furious," he said softly. "I could have been," I admitted. "But fury makes the world noisy. I prefer my life to be clear." I smiled and he smiled back, small and tentative. The room felt different then. Not healed, but open. When he left that evening, he hugged me the way a son might hug a mother, not clinging, not desperate, but firm. Outside on the stoop, he paused and looked at the house, as if seeing it new. "Thank you," he said, voice low, "for listening, for everything." "You're welcome," I said. "Now go on, fix what you can." His footsteps faded down the walk. The door closed softly behind him, and I stood in the quiet of my kitchen with the folder of papers beside me, and the afternoon light cooling into evening. I had not shouted, I had not made threats, I had only shown him the truth, and in the spaces that followed, I could almost feel the shape of what would come next. Careful, legal, patient. Quiet justice, if you like, not born of spite, but of a life that knew the value of steady things. The house smelled like paint and lemon oil the first morning I walked back in. It was the kind of smell that feels hopeful, clean, and honest, like a blank page. I had driven up the lane a month after the papers were filed, and the lawyers had done what lawyers do best, straighten the crooked lines on paper, so life can follow. The porch steps were steady beneath my feet, the same worn wood I'd always trusted. It was strange and not strange at all to stand there and feel that old familiar give under my soles, as if nothing had ever been lost. Inside, the rooms were quieter than I remembered, not empty in a hard way, but settled. I had taken only what mattered, a few photographs, my husband's old toolbox, the rocking chair that knew how to cradle me, the small china bowl Mother gave me when I was first married. I repainted the living room myself, choosing a warm off-white that made the afternoon light spill like milk across the floor. It felt good, careful work. Mixing colors, brushing each stroke, it all reminded me that things can be mended slowly and with patience. I moved through the rooms the way you move through a house, by muscle memory. My fingers traced the banister where my palms had smoothed years ago. I paused at the kitchen window where Michael used to stand, and stirred his cereal half asleep, hair still sticking up. I opened the cupboard where Linda's teacups lived and set them gently back in their place. It was small and domestic, but it felt like reclaiming a rhythm the way you reclaim a favorite song. People ask me sometimes if it felt like vengeance to change the locks back and sign the papers that made the house mine again. It didn't. There was no triumph in turning a key that had been out of my hand. There was the relief of a truth honored. There was also the acceptance that life has seasons. Some you give away, some you keep, and some you take back, so you can breathe properly. I wanted the house to be a refuge, not a battleground. I wanted it to be a place where laughter could return without being measured. The day the young woman came to look at the downstairs apartment, she arrived with a small suitcase and a toddler asleep in her arms. Her name was Marissa. She had the kind of tired that comes from nights of bad sleep and mornings that begin too early, but her smile was soft and honest. She told me between nurse shifts and whispered apologies for the state of her hair that she was starting over, a new job in town, a little money saved from overtime, and a hope that her boy would have a safe place to grow up. When I showed her the apartment, the little kitchen trimmed with the same off-white paint, the window that looked out over the back garden where the roses were just waking up, she sighed, the kind of sigh that sounds like both gratitude and disbelief. "It's perfect," she said, eyes bright with something I recognized as the exact same hope I had when Michael was small. I could see a mirror of my own younger self in her. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she cradled her son like a small treasure. I liked her instantly. We did the paperwork together, plain and practical. I kept it simple because that's how I like things best. I didn't want a tenancy that felt transactional. I wanted it to feel like two lives quietly supporting each other under the same roof. We agreed on rent that was fair, and on simple rules: knock before entering, respect each other's space, and never ever go to bed angry at each other if it can be helped. I told her stories about the house when it was young, how the oak tree in the front yard was planted the day Michael was born, how the little porch light used to be a lighthouse during a hurricane we'd weathered once. She laughed and promised to keep the roses alive. On the morning I placed the old key on the kitchen counter, the house felt like it had folded gently around me. The key was a small brass thing, tarnished at the edges where my thumb had rubbed it with habit. It had a small chip from the day I dropped it in the sink, the tiny imperfection that made it entirely mine. I set it down and watched it catch the sunlight. It looked like a little promise. "You finally fit again," I whispered, though there was no one in the room but the quiet. I was speaking to years and to memory, to the life that had been mine before grief and then before betrayal. Saying it aloud felt like placing a hand back over something that had always been mine, not to keep it locked away, but to make sure it could be a home again. The days that followed were slow and full in a way that was different from the hurried busyness of looking after someone else. It was my time to tend to things I'd let slip while I'd been giving. The hedges needed trimming, a loose hinge needed tightening, a leaky faucet required patience rather than panic. I took my time. I worked with my hands the way I used to, and each little repair felt like a stitch in a wider healing. Michael did come back sometimes to help in small ways. He'd pop in with groceries or a story about something that had gone wrong at work, and we made room for those things. Our conversations were steady and honest. He apologized in ways that mattered, not with dramatic pleas, but with quiet actions, helping with a heavy box, fixing the sag in the step, sitting and listening when I wanted to remember, or to simply be. The relationship between us changed, but it didn't break. It became different, shaped by boundaries and respect instead of assumptions. Jenna left eventually. They decided they wanted something different, or perhaps she realized that building a life by ignoring who had made a home possible was a shaky foundation. I think wounds heal when people are honest about what they need. Her leaving was not the end of a scandal. It was the close of a chapter. I didn't rejoice. I simply continued my work of making this place whole again. There were mornings when I would sit on the porch with a mug of coffee and watch Marissa and her son chase each other in the yard, the boys' laughter like a small bell. I would water the roses, humming an old hymn my mother used to sing, and feel the sun warm my back. Life's simplest pleasures came back to me like friends returning from a long trip, familiar, comforting, easily welcomed. I planted a small vegetable patch by the side of the house. There's something honest about watching things grow because you planted them yourself. Tomatoes that redden slowly in the sun, basil that perfumes the kitchen window, carrots you pull up like small conical surprises. I made a habit of giving the first tomato to Marissa's little boy. He'd grin with a toothy mouth and declare it the best tomato ever, which, to be fair, it always was. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a pie and a note that said, "Welcome home." Mrs. Ellison stood on the porch with two sturdy arms and a smile that had survived 100 seasons. She hugged me and said, "It's good to see you holding your place, Evelyn." Her words were simple and true. Community is an odd, gentle thing. It remembers who you are when you forget, and it keeps a place for you, even when the map changes. There were times I'd catch myself thinking about the past, about the nights I sat in my car and watched lights behind curtains, about the ache I'd carried for weeks. Those memories were not erased by the calm I'd found. They were folded into it. I learned to carry them as part of my story rather than letting them define my everyday. They were the weather of a season that had passed, and now the sky was clearing. I began to teach again in a small way. The local community center had an adult ed class for simple home repairs, and I signed up to teach a session on basic plumbing and painting. People laughed at first, a little old lady teaching such things, but then they watched me show them how to mend a leaky pipe and how to mix paint to match a faded wall. "It's not about muscle," I told them. "It's about patience and knowing where to look." The class filled with folks who needed confidence more than instruction, and seeing them leave with a small tool belt and a smile was a kind of quiet joy I hadn't expected. At night I sit by the window and the house hums with the small sounds of living. Marissa's soft lullaby through an open window, the distant sound of a car passing, settling of wood, Sometimes I read, sometimes I write letters I don't mail. Sometimes I simply sit and watch the light move across the room and think about how steady things can become when you stop wrestling with the past and start tending the present. If there's a lesson I'd want people to take from my story, it's not one about winning or being clever. It's about remembering that your life is a thing you have a say in, that giving doesn't require erasing yourself and reclaiming doesn't require cruelty. You can be kind and still be firm. You can forgive and still set boundaries. You can let the years teach you how to stand straight again. When I place that little brass key beside the sink at night, it feels right. It's a small thing, heavy with memory and useful in a practical way. That comes from tending what you love, and making room for joy again is something no one can take unless you give it away. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt the sting of being overlooked, or the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming what's yours, please like the video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. If you'd like more stories like this, quiet, true, and about ordinary people doing hard, good things, subscribe and stay a while. It means a lot to have company on this porch.